I'm often asked, what is one of the most important things that you can teach? What is the most important thing that you can share? And I remember a number of years ago hearing about the last lecture. And there was a professor who found out that he was dying, and he decided that he would create the last lecture series. And for him, it was, what's the most important things, most important lessons that you've learned. And today I want to share with you what I believe is the single most important leadership lesson I have learned in my life that I want to pass on to you today, because it makes a massive difference in your business, in your life, in your world. And as a result of that, I'm going to spend some time on this one because I think it's critical to the success of your business, to the success of your team, to the success of what is accomplished in your life and in your world. It's not just business, it's personal. It helps you in your family. It helps you with relationships. It helps you in all kinds of things. And so today I want to talk to you about it in light of your business, because I believe it's one of the most profound leadership lessons. And I'm going to use my presentation notes just so that you can follow with me as we do it. Because I think it's really helpful to have a flow to this. And so I'm gonna start by really setting the premise of it, which is all of us in business have goals and objectives we're trying to achieve. And those are completed tasks, projects, outcomes, results, deadlines, quality and quantity of things, certain types of behavior, certain types of appearances that we expect to be done by our teams, by our staff, by our people. And in a lot of cases, in terms of accomplishing those results, the people that you have doing it for you are essentially the way you get things done in a business. And yet so often in my conversations with owners, with executives, with leaders, with managers, I hear this kind of result or response: an ongoing sense of frustration, an ongoing sense of disappointment, anger, exasperation, aggravation, irritation, displeasure at the ability of team members to actually accomplish this outcome that a business owner, executive, manager is trying to reach. And when we dig into it and we kind of get ourselves under the hood of what's going on and why the disappointment and why the frustration, what I often come across is that, and I come across this because frankly, I've done a lot in my life and I still do it. But it's this, that many times what we're doing as owners, leaders, managers is we're managing by expectation and assumption of reality. We're managing by assumption or by expectation, and that's where we get the issue. So what is expectation? Expectation is that eager anticipation, belief, or hope that something will happen. Right? That's the dilemma is if we're managing by expectation, we're managing by anticipation or hope that something will happen in the future. Well, what about assumption? Well, assumption accepts something as true or certain without proof. So do you see where you can start running into problems? If you're managing by expectation or by assumption, there's either anticipation, belief, or hope, or there's accepting something true or certain that you have zero proof of. And as a result, when my expectation or assumption of reality is greater than my experience of reality, I have a gap. There's this gap between those two. So what I expect or what do I assume and my experience of that gap is there impacting and affecting me. Well, when you got a gap between what you expect and your experience, when that gap is different, often that's where we feel frustration, disappointment, anger, betrayal, exasperation, aggravation, irritation, displeasure. That's where it shows up, when there's a gap. And that gap could be small. It could be just minor. So somebody didn't dress the way I wanted them to, or I expected something or assumed something would be done and it didn't really get done, but it's not major. Or sometimes it's massive. There's these massive things that you're expecting to happen or assuming will happen in your reality that aren't. And so either way, we get these negative feelings. These negative feelings show up in us that cause a lot of discomfort, distress, frustration, and that's what I experience, and I have experienced, and I experience in my conversations with people. Except there are some cases where those negative feelings don't show up, and generally it's the case where my experience of reality exceeds my expectation or assumption of reality. But nobody ever talks to me about those because nothing really happens in those. Our frustration, our anxiety, that stuff, that negative energy in us comes up when I feel the gap. And when I feel the gap, often what I start to do, and this is kind of how I've tried to accomplish dealing with the gap, when my experience or my expectation or assumption of reality is not met, and I feel that gap, that anger, that thing in me related to my team, then I try and communicate. And then I aim to be in the coaching mode or a training mode. Sometimes I aim for bribery if I can just pay people enough. I develop process and procedure documents. I put pressure. I amp up guilt. I discipline people. I threaten them. I terminate people. I've done that before. And it all is related to this feeling that I have in me when there is a gap present between what I expect or assume and what my reality is. So the problem is that when I'm stuck in the gap and I'm sitting there in the gap, I am often with my team, with my staff, and I expect you are doing the same, is that you're stuck dealing with this thing called the reticular activating system. And the reticular activating system is really the internal mechanism in our brain that is taking our reality and somehow subconsciously watching it and observing it. And so, I don't know, the best way for me to describe the reticular activating system is, let's assume you want to go buy a car and you think this car is kind of unique and special, and you walk into the dealership and you either buy or lease that vehicle. And that vehicle is got like, it's special, it's unique, it's different. And yet weirdly, the minute you drive it off the lot, you see those cars everywhere. Everybody has that car that for a moment you thought was unique. And that's, to me, what the reticular activating system is doing. It's really processing something that you've put attention on and you've given attention on, which creates energy in you. And when you give energy and attention to something, it starts to grow all over you. It starts to grow all over. You see it all over. And that's, I think, what's happening with the gap that we experience, that frustration, that anger that we feel with our teams when our assumptions and expectations are not living up to, or when the reality is not living up to our assumptions and expectations of our team. And so that reticular activating system, I believe, enhances the gap. It makes the gap worse because we're always looking for it. Where are they not living up to what I'm expecting? Where are they not living up to what I want from them, what I assume they'll deliver? And I believe, and I've seen this in myself and I see it in so many others, that what that leads to is when I'm constantly looking for it, it starts to lead to this sense, and I see it in owners and in leaders that I talk to on a regular basis, that what starts to happen is it becomes like a me versus them. So when we're stuck in the gap all the time, when we assume and expect things from our team and we're watching for it and they're failing to deliver, it's almost like they're out to get us, right? And we become somewhat victim to it. We become, it's like this adversarial position we get in it with our team members. And in many cases, I know because I've been on the other side, is what they're likely feeling and what they're likely experiencing is resentment, confusion, discouragement, defensiveness, because something's amok. Well, the reason, I like this quote, the reason for placing blame repeatedly fails to work is that I repeatedly place it on everyone else instead of where it actually belongs. And I think that's what happens, because ultimately self-deception is my inability to see that I have a problem. And when it comes to the gap, I believe that there is a issue that we have to address. And that issue starts by telling ourselves the truth. And this truth is, it's not about them. When my expectations and assumptions are not being met, it's not about my team member. It's not about my employee. It's not about anyone that works for me or serves me or is a vendor to me. It's about me. It's about something going on in me, or it's about you. And if you're struggling with the gap and the perpetual frustration you feel that the reality that you want is not being met or fulfilled, then this is not about them out there. It's about you. Well, I think there's some things that even make it worse. And there's some reasons we make the gap worse before I talk to you about how to solve that. So the first one is, we believe our team members are mind readers. And we have this weird assumption that our teams can read our mind. And yeah, granted, they get to know us and they get to understand us, but they can't read our mind. So with me, I know that I'll often think about or process an idea for weeks at a time. I'll hear this really cool thing that we can adopt in the business, and I'll think about it and I'll process it in my head, and I'll be out walking and I'll go, yeah, that's a great idea. And then I write things down and I do some research and I go online, and then I have this expectation that starts to grow that my team will logically make sense of something when I drop it to them the first time. And I think a lot of times when we believe our team are mind readers and we don't have the ability to properly give them the details, the advice, the direction that they need, we enhance the gap. The second gap enhancer I find is that we have an assumption of their knowledge and expertise related to something that we want to accomplish. So let's say we're trying to do a specific project, and that project has a whole set of criteria to it and it's got an end result. And a lot of times we get stuck in that gap because we're assuming a lot of what they know or have expertise in, even though we haven't clearly identified it. So what we do is we enhance that gap, and they disappoint us because, well, we're assuming things about them without having clear evidence of that. This is another one I find a lot in conversations that I deal with, is a lot of times we believe we've hired a hero, right? We interviewed them and they had all of this capability, all this skill. They presented their best self in the interview. And then when it comes time to actually do a task. So let's take, for instance, sales. So I talk to people and they talk a lot about how sales reps just really disappoint them. And yet a lot of times we hired somebody assuming they would fulfill a task that we had for them, which is selling things. And yet when they come in and they start to take on the process of actually doing sales, they start to the reality is way less than our expectation. And it's often because so often we assume we've got a hero there. And the reality is this person just has to slug it out every day to get the result. But it's a gap enhancer. It creates a bigger gap. And if you remember, the reticular activating system is always going, where's the gap? Where's the gap? Where's the gap? They're disappointing me. They're frustrating me. But if you assume this person is a hero, they're never going to succeed. The next one is my desperation, my lack of planning, my uncertainty, my whatever it is becomes their issue or failure. So I have expectations that they will accomplish things in a certain way. They'll do a project, they'll do a task, they'll answer the phone in a certain way, they'll deliver a client outcome in a certain way. And yet so often as an owner, as an executive, my lack of planning and uncertainty gets put on them, right? When I've not done something right and I put it now on them, um, assuming that they will somehow magically figure this out, and it becomes their issue or failure. And it's a gap enhancer because it's not their issue, it's my issue. And just to add one layer to this, sometimes the other gap enhancer for me is my perception of another's success or success at another time. So somebody has had success in previous. So let's say one of my staff members did a task particularly well at a previous time, and I went, well, they should do that task in the same way as they did it last time, because that's what I expect or assume they will do. But the dilemma is, if I don't have a clear understanding of what's actually being processed, what else is in play between those two separate instances, see, I assume or expect it to be a certain way, and they're just delivering it based on their reality at the time. And that's where the gap. So notice there's all these gap enhancers that really amplify this distinction between my expectation or my assumption and their reality. So my goal for you today, and my goal and what we're going to talk about for the rest of the time, is to remove the gap. To remove the gap, because the gap is ultimately your issue. The gap is your issue. And the way to remove the gap is to quit growing it, to quit focusing on it, to quit assuming, to quit expecting, and do something very different. And it's this. Today, I want to talk to you about managing by commitment and not by expectation or assumption. See, that to me is the essence of blowing the gap away. Getting rid of gap thinking, getting rid of assumption and expectation is managing by commitment.